Okay, archaeological proof for the Torah and the Exodus. We all something that everybody wants to know and everybody wants to see. So today we want to really look at two things. The goal is to look at the evidence. Where is the evidence? Because there is a lot of it. And the second part is, why don't we see the evidence? Because there's so much evidence. We're so lucky to live in a generation where there's so much information, but we don't hear about it for some reason. You know, most people think that, you know, Torah, Exodus, our patriarchs, there's no evidence for that. You hear that really commonly. People say, oh, there's no evidence for it, whatever, like, is it just stories, mythology? But in reality, there's actually tons of really solid evidence. Okay, so we want to see that evidence, or some of that evidence. Of course, we can't cover everything today in 1 hour, but we're going to cover as much as we can. So we're going to see some of the big pieces of evidence, and then also why we don't see it. Why don't we see that evidence presented to us more regularly? And the way I'm going to do this is I want to go through just some of the major pieces of evidence for not just the Torah, but really the whole Tanakh, the whole history, and learn along the way, just remind you about some of our ancient history, ancient Israelite history, what the Tanakh says. And at the end, I'll leave the best for last. So I know we all want to hear about the Exodus. That's the biggest question, but I'll leave that to the end. All right, so best for last. So I'll start with a bit of a case study, okay? Not in any particular chronological order. After this, I'm going to go in chronological order. But I want to start with this, because this is something that's an incredible archaeological discovery, and not just one, at least 27 of them at last count. Seals that look like this is one example, that have inscriptions of the name Yakov, or Yaqub, or Yaqub-Har, but they basically say the name Yakov, okay? And these were found all over. They've been found in Egypt, they've been found in Israel, they've been found in Syria. And all of them date to the same time period, between 1800 and 1600 BCE, which is roughly, based on our traditional calendar, the time that Yaakov, Jacob, our main patriarch, you can say main, because he is the father of the tribes, right? So Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov. Yaakov was the father, became Israel. Right? Yaakov was the one that was renamed Israel, and his 12 sons gave roots to the 12 tribes. So Yaakov, in that sense, is the most important, the most significant. And we have at least 27 seals in the right time, in the right place, with his name on it. This is something that's pretty incredible. And I say in the right place because if you remember the story, Yaakov was born in Israel. And then at one point he had to run away to Syria, right? And he spent 20 years living with his uncle, Lavan, in Syria, in Haran. And then he spent the last 17 years of his life in Egypt. So we would expect, if we were to find evidence of Yaakov in history, we would expect, you know, his items to be in Egypt, in Syria, in Israel, where he spent all of his life in those three places. And it's all in the right time period, right time, right place. It's pretty amazing. And the exact name. And I want to show you this video, just a short excerpt from the Exodus Decoded, great documentary.
At the time of their arrival, one Israelite rose to the highest levels of Egyptian power. His name was Joseph, son of Yaakov, Jacob in English, and he became so powerful that he wore on his finger the seal of royal authority. Discovering Joseph's seal at Avaris would prove that the Israelites arrived here exactly when our timeline predicts.
So Avaris, I'll mention that again later. Avaris is the main city in the northeastern Egypt, what the Torah would call Goshen, right, where the Israelites were slaves.
That would be like finding a needle in a 3,700-year-old archaeological haystack. Incredibly, the tiny seal was found, precisely at the archaeological layer we anticipated. In fact, Professor Manfred Bitak found no less than 9 seals worn by Joseph's court officials. Inscribed right on them is the Hebrew name Yaakov, Joseph's father.
it's very strange that we found 9 seals with the name Yaqub-Har. It's a biblical name, by the way. The original was probably mounted on a ring worn on the finger. And this gives us a new puzzle.
Is it really a puzzle? Not if one uses our chronology. This is the only time that a Hebrew name appears on an Egyptian royal seal. It directly connects Avaris with the Bible. But Professor Bitak steers clear of biblical chronology. He's under the constant watch of the Egyptian Antiquities Authority, who have made Avaris off limits to the public. Supposedly for conservation reasons, Professor Bitak has been forced to cover up his dig every single year. The area is then plowed, seeded, and cultivated by local farmers. No one would suspect that underneath these fields lies an archaeological treasure trove.
Think about what was just said there. So one is you see the actual seals that were found at Avaris in Goshen, where the Israelites lived and then were eventually enslaved. And it ends with this, the Egyptian authorities watching him, right? This is an Austrian archaeologist, not Jewish, but a biblical archaeologist. And they are making sure, the Egyptian authorities, that they're in control of the narrative. Because God forbid that you find any proof for something to do with Israel in Egypt, right? So there's all this politics going on, and they are purposefully suppressing the evidence. So suppressed evidence is one of the reasons why we don't see more evidence, right? Because anytime something great's discovered, this we know about, but think about how many other things may have been discovered that never saw the light of day, that were immediately shut down. I want to quote from Samuel Karinsky, fascinating book called The Eighth Day, really amazing. Anybody who loves history and archaeology should read it. So he talks about a similar case that happened in Syria, in a place in Ebla, which is roughly where Abraham and Yaakov would have lived, the area of Haran in Syria. So they found there all kinds of tablets, Ebla tablets. Many of them have the name Avram written on them. Right, so this is an example, one example of these documents. So they found tons of evidence supporting what the Torah says of that time and place. Unfortunately, I'm just reading here, they are located in modern Syria, Iraq, and Iran, where unprejudiced evaluation of the findings of those engaged in the work is impossible to publicly pronounce. So the great philologist, epigrapher, and Semiticist Professor Giovanni Pettinato, to his bitter regret, found this unhappy fact to be true. The Syrians, incensed by the inferences, cracked down on the scientists of the mission. The Director General of the Syrian Department of Antiquities and Museums demanded a formal declaration from Pettinato outlining his position on the relationship of the inscriptions to both Syrian and biblical history. Pettinato dutifully submitted an official declaration in which he penitently wrote, "The documents that I've had the honor to decipher and study always give us more evidence of the central role of Syria in the history of the third millenary. We are not authorized to make the inhabitants of Ebla predecessors of Israel," right? So the government is forcing this archaeologist to change his views, make sure you don't connect this to anything in the Torah, to anything that has to do with Israel, right? So he has to give this, you know, he's forced to make a declaration saying, no, this is all about Syria, right? Everything that we're finding is only about Syria. This has nothing to do with the predecessors of Israel, right? So that's the kind of thing that's going on. There's all this politics involved in suppressing real, genuine, solid evidence. Like, it doesn't get better than this, right? We now see 2 documents from the right time period, from the right place, that clearly mention the names of our patriarchs. Okay? And of course, there's always going to be people that deny it, say, no, it's not that Abraham, it's got to be somebody else, right? That was probably a common name back then. It wasn't that Yaakov. There must have been many people named Yaakov all over in Egypt, Syria, and Israel at that time period. So there's always going to be people who, skeptics who will always say, no, there's never enough evidence. Aside from suppressed evidence, there's also a great deal of lost evidence, right? When you think about it, so much time has elapsed since then. It's been over 3,000 years. How much are we really going to have? And most of the evidence has already been destroyed or lost. So to quote from Samuel Karinsky again, he talks about how, for example, when Josephus, if you remember Josephus, he was originally a Jew 2,000 years ago. And when the Romans, during the Great Revolt, when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, he actually surrendered and joined the Romans. So because of that, he was heavily criticized by the Jewish community, and the rabbis of the time didn't look upon him very favorably, and his works were never really accepted in Jewish, kind of in the mainstream Jewish corpus of books. But he wrote basically as a Jew to explain to the Romans who the Jews are, and it's really amazing to read. If you really want to understand Judaism 2,000 years ago in the Second Temple era, you need to read Josephus. And today you can buy the whole set. It's not expensive. It's like a massive text, fine print, like hundreds and hundreds of pages, but it's fascinating to read. So one of the things that he says, he talks about all the people that wrote about Abraham in his day, 2,000 years ago, and before him, that he drew from, the sources that he drew from. So he says, Hezekiah does more than merely mention Abraham. He composed a book concerning him. So you have a Greek historian scholar that actually wrote a book. There was a book about Abraham, a Greek source from the time of Alexander the Great about Abraham. And Josephus then gives a list of all the people that wrote about Abraham. So quoting him, in addition to these cited, there was Theophilus and Theodotus and Meneceus and Aristophanes and Hermogenes, all these people, and maybe many more, he says, for my reading has not been exhaustive, right? So Josephus is saying, I haven't read all the information out there about Abraham. So you can imagine how much, none of these people, by the way, we don't have any of these sources today, right? All these sources have been lost to us, but Josephus had them 2,000 years ago, right? So they had a lot of evidence that we don't see anymore. Right? So just to keep that in mind, that so much evidence has been lost. The vast majority of evidence has been lost. So we're lucky to find what little is left because so much time has passed. And also keep in mind that famous statement that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Right? So absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because you can't find it or haven't found it yet doesn't mean that you won't or that it proves something. Okay, so despite all this, we do have evidence. So that's what we want to go through now. Where is that evidence? So let's see it. Let's go on this little whirlwind quick tour of some of my favorite pieces of evidence, at least, and there's many more, just what I collected from different books and sources. And then we're going to end with the Exodus. So the first one is the Merneptah Stele or Stela. So this dates back to about the year 1210 BCE. So just to put things in perspective, based on our Hebrew calendar dating, we came out of Egypt in the year 2448 on our calendar. So our current year right now is 5781. Okay, so that you can do the math. So we came out of Egypt in 2448, which is about 1312 BCE, roughly, based on our calendar. And so based on our calendar, we would have been in 40 years later, have entered the Holy Land around 1272, and would have started to, build our land, build our nation up in Israel. And so around 1210, we have evidence of, we have the Stela, which actually describes the campaigns of Merneptah, who's the Pharaoh of Egypt. He is the son of Ramses II. And this is the oldest known text that actually says the word Israel in it. It mentions Israel. It says that Merneptah invaded Canaan and defeated Israel there, that he fought Israel. It describes all the people, all the nations he defeated, and one of them is Israel in Canaan. So the simplest thing here is that it proves to us that there was a nation called Israel in the Holy Land over 3,000 years ago. 3,200 years ago, there was already a people called Israel. There was an Israel back then. So it's appropriate to talk about this now because of Yom Ha'atzmaut. So it's we've been in the Holy Land for a very long time, right? So you already have a clear Egyptian record from the time of Merneptah that confirms that. But what's even more amazing about this is Merneptah was the son of Ramses II. Ramses II had a very long reign. And usually people identify Ramses II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And pretty much every movie, it's always Ramses. And the reason is because the Torah never names the Pharaoh. It always just calls him Pharaoh. But it does tell us that the Israelites built the city of Ramses, that they built two main cities, the Torah says, Pitom and Ramses. Okay, so it would make sense that if they're building the city of Ramses, it's probably, probably the Pharaoh would have been Ramses, right? Because we know how all megalomaniac rulers think, right? I'm going to build a city and name it after me. Who else am I going to name it after, right? So they all build cities for themselves. So it's very likely that it could have also been maybe Ramses I. Maybe it started earlier, right? Because they were slaves for a long time. So it could have been commissioned by Ramses I, maybe Seti. There are different ideas, but the pharaoh of the Exodus is usually thought to be Ramses II, and there's a lot of evidence to support that. And so you have his son now, very appropriately, commissioning this great slab stone, recording how he defeated Israel. So I think there's something almost poetic about that also, because if you imagine, if you can think of how Ramses would have been really seriously embarrassed and defeated by this, and he would have wanted vengeance, and it would be really appropriate for his son to, take that revenge upon himself and try to defeat, this nation, the Israelites that brought Egypt to its knees and that ran away. So we would expect that Merneptah, the son of Ramses, like any good son, would want to do that for his father, right? We can all understand that. So he'd send a campaign to Israel to defeat that ancient enemy. So that's one piece of evidence, really clear, really amazing. Building on that, also from Egypt, the Karnak Reliefs. So they describe the campaigns of the pharaoh Shoshank. And here you have the first mention of Yehuda, of the kingdom of Judah. Okay, so again, a little bit of the history. If you remember, King David had a unified kingdom in Israel, kingdom of Israel. All the 12 tribes were united when David was king. And then when his son was king, David's son was Solomon, right, Shlomo. When he was king, also everybody was unified. But King Solomon had to raise taxes because he had to build a temple. Remember, the King Solomon's the one that built the temple. So he raised taxes to pay for that, and also to build himself a palace, and also to build a lot of great works in Israel. And they built a navy, and they did all kinds of things. And so when King Solomon passed away, his son, Rehoboam, took over. And then the people came to him and said, listen, it's cool that your father raised taxes, but now we're done. Like, we built the temple, you have your palace, we have all this stuff. Why are our taxes still so high? Please lower our taxes. And Rehoboam's elders told him, yeah, you probably should lower the taxes. You should do what the people say. And instead, he listened to his young, foolish friends and said, no, don't be soft. They're taking advantage of you, and just raise their taxes even more. And that's what he did. And the people rebelled. So aside from his own tribe of Yehuda, all the other tribes rebelled and separated and created their own kingdom, the northern kingdom, kingdom of Israel, also called in the Tanakh, very frequently called the kingdom of Ephraim, because the kings in the north came from the tribe of Ephraim, which was the most powerful and the most populous tribe. And their king was first Yerovam from the tribe of Ephraim, and then others that followed him, some his descendants. So there was, after King Solomon, Israel splits in two. So in the south, you have the kingdom of Judah with its capital in Jerusalem. And in the north, you have the kingdom of Ephraim, or the kingdom of Israel, with the remaining tribes. So here, the Tanakh mentions this pharaoh, calls him Shishak. Okay, the Egyptians, it says Shoshank, but basically the same person. And the Tanakh says how in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, now that the kingdom has been split, Shishak basically invaded. And the Karnak Reliefs say the same thing, corroborate what's written in the Tanakh, that Shoshank invaded and sacked the kingdom of Judah. So really shortly after, like just 5 years after the kingdom of Judah actually forms, separate from the rest of Israel, you already see that there's an archaeological clear finding that mentions it, and in an Egyptian wall relief. So this confirms for us that the kingdom of Judah was a thing, right? There was a Jewish kingdom almost 3,000 years ago then, and confirms this whole civil war and the separation, something extra biblical that confirms an important biblical event. And I put a little asterisk beside Jewish, because in English, it sounds a little funny. In English, we say Jew, like a Jew, Jewish, and it sounds different than somebody from the tribe of Judah, a Judahite. But like that's like a weird, peculiar aspect of English, which I don't think it exists in any other language. Like in Hebrew, a Yehudi is a Jew and also somebody from the tribe of Judah, because that was the only tribe that ultimately survived. So there's no distinction between being from the tribe of Judah and being a Jew. You're a Yehudi, right? So in Hebrew, when you say Yehudi, that means I'm a Jew, but it really means I'm from the tribe of Judah. That's what Yehudi means, right? And in German, it's like that too, right? In German, like Juden means Jews, but also Juden means people from the tribe of Judah. So it just like it works out. But for some reason in English, it's Jewish is separate. Like being a Jew is, they really should call us Judas, I guess. But I guess it sounds strange. So that's why I put a little asterisk there, because in most other languages, a Jewish kingdom would be the same thing as saying a Judahite kingdom, right? Like a Yehudi kingdom. Just that linguistic distinction. In some languages, we're not called Jews at all. We're defined by our language. So like in Russian or in Greek or in Italian, we're called Hebrews, right? Like Hebreo, right? Like whatever it is, like you're either called, in some languages we're defined by our tribe, and in some languages we're defined by our language. We're called Hebrews. Very interesting. Okay, following that, so we said the kingdom split in half. You have the kingdom of Israel or Ephraim in the north, the kingdom of Judah in the south. We have another set of reliefs, okay, the Kurkh Monoliths, which tell us that there was this northern kingdom of Israel. And here it doesn't just mention Israel, but it mentions that there's two of these monoliths, and it mentions Ahabu Sirila, which is the king, Ahab of Israel, very important king in the Tanakh. He was one of the mighty kings in the north. Not a very good person. He's considered a very wicked king, though he repented somewhat at the end of his life. And so we have, again, clear extra-biblical evidence from outside of Israel that confirms that there was a kingdom of Israel, that there was a king named Ahav, that he had a mighty army, just like the Tanakh tells us. Okay, so these are not just stories. When we read the Tanakh, I teach Tanakh and I teach this section about Ahav, and it's amazing to be able to teach it and know that there's tons of archaeological evidence to support that these were real people. These are not just stories. By the way, Ahav is the king that was at the time of Eliyahu, right? All the stories in the Tanakh with Ahav, or most of the stories, Ahav versus Eliyahu and Nabi. So Eliyahu is probably the most important, in some ways, the most important of the prophets, at least after Moses, and appears everywhere. Eliyahu is probably the most prolific figure in Jewish texts. He appears everywhere, in the Zohar and in the Talmud, and everywhere is Eliyahu, right? At our Pesach Seder, Eliyahu comes at the Pesach Seder. Every bris, Eliyahu is there. So Eliyahu is a very key figure in Judaism. And in the Tanakh, Ahav and Eliyahu are the two that are always going head to head. So we have a clear piece of evidence that Ahav exists. Closely related to that, another stela, the Moabite Stone, or the Mesha Stele, named after King Mesha, who again is mentioned in the Tanakh. This is an amazing piece of evidence because it dates back to about 840 BC, and it has a clear mention of Yud-He Vav-He, of Hashem. This is the oldest known, again, extra-biblical text, something outside of the Torah, outside of the Tanakh, that mentions God's name. Okay. And kind of sets up this conflict between, supposedly, the God of the Moabites and the God of Israel. And it mentions here also both dynasties, both the north and southern kingdom. It mentions the dynasty of Omri, who was the king in the north, or at least not at that particular time, but it was his dynasty, and the house of David. Right? It actually says the words Beit David. So this is, again, a piece of evidence that talks about the house of King David. Really clear, same language, by the way, same 22-letter alphabet. So the Moabite stone confirms pretty much very closely to what the Tanakh records about this event. Right? The Tanakh tells us that the northern king of Israel and the southern king at that time, Yehoshaphat, they made an alliance with the king of another kingdom, Edom, and the three of them went to war against Moab, against King Mesha. So we have in detail that whole story and what happened during that war. So the Tanakh tells us our side of the story. We had a prophet at that time, Elisha, Elisha was the disciple of Eliyahu. So Eliyahu Navi, when he was taken up to heaven, right, he left Elisha as his disciple, and this happens shortly after that. The Moabite stone tells the same story from the Moabite perspective, which is really fascinating, right? Praising their God and so on. So same story from two different perspectives. A lot of the same details, confirm the same details. It's really amazing to be able to read something so ancient, an event so ancient from two different perspectives, from both sides. So the Tanakh tells us that there was a big miracle that happened during this time. That the Moabites actually thought they saw like a pool of blood, and they thought that the Israelites had all started fighting each other and killed each other, and so they thought they'd very easily beat them. And then when they got there, turned out that it was just an illusion, and then the Israelites defeated the Moabites. But then the story ends with the Moabites actually managing to fight off the Israelites, and the Israelites retreat. So that's what the Tanakh says. And the Moabite stone confirms a lot of those same details from the other side, from the other perspective, without the miracle from Hashem, but praising their God as having helped them in this fight. Really important piece, important document, right? So you have something that mentions God's name, so ancient, right? Hashem, Yud Hey Vav Hey, Beit David, Omri. Augusto?
So who are the Moabites? Where were they living?
So Moab is literally just across the Dead Sea. So if you've ever been to the Dead Sea in Israel and you were floating there and you see across the other side, right? You come in from the Israel side, but you can see the land on the other side. That's Moab. Okay, so Moab is the land, what today would be Jordan.
Jordan, yes.
Okay, so just on the other side of the Dead Sea. Okay, so the Tanakh tells us that the miracle that I was referring to was that this alliance of Israel, Judah, and Edom, they were marching with their armies through the desert around the Dead Sea, right? Going around the Dead Sea, and it's a desert, it's the Negev, and they had no water left. So that's when they called the prophet Elisha to say what's going on, like talk to God, help us out, right? And then Elisha says, okay, don't worry, God will take care of you. And God does a miracle where he causes, I guess, the groundwaters to open and the valley fills with water, and the soldiers are saved, and God promises them that they would, the battle would go smoothly for them. And it's those waters that confuse the Moabites, because the Moabites are looking at this from their side, and they're seeing, wait, what just happened? Why is there all this water? They thought it looked red to them, and they thought it was like a pool of blood. So they were surprised because it was a desert, and suddenly the desert appears to them like a pool of blood. So that's how it all connects. So Moab is just in Jordan, like on the other side of the Dead Sea. Okay, next we have the Taylor Prism. So it goes back to the king that in the Tanakh is called Sancheriv, right? And Sancheriv was the one that destroyed the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and exiled its tribes. So we often hear of this idea of the 10 lost tribes, right? We've heard that before. So Sancheriv was the king that destroyed the northern kingdom and exiled all those people. But when he tried to also destroy the southern kingdom, Yehuda, he was unable to. And the king at that time was Hezekiah, and he was a very righteous king. And God sent a miracle that he struck the camp of the Assyrians, sent an angel, and the Assyrians basically all died and retreated, and Jerusalem was saved. So the Taylor Prism records Sancheriv's, in his own words, what happened and how he conquered all these regions and destroyed Israel and whatever. And then when he gets to talking about Jerusalem and Hezekiah, so it mentions Jerusalem and Yehuda and Hezekiah. So here's the exact inscription in the Syrian and the actual name. So Jerusalem, his city, Hezekiah, Judah actually mentions all of these events. And of course, you wouldn't expect Sancheriv to write that some disaster occurred, a miracle occurred, and he was defeated. So what you see with here, something really interesting is that Sancheriv here inscribes that he caged up Hezekiah like a bird, and that's it, and like forced him to pay tribute. It doesn't say anything about having defeated him. He lists having defeated all these other people, but doesn't say how he defeated Hezekiah. Right? So doesn't mention God's miracle, obviously, because no king would record his failures for the future, but does indirectly prove that he was not able to conquer Jerusalem despite having such a massive army. And the Tanakh tells us exactly the same, that he tried and he besieged Jerusalem, but God sent a miracle and he failed and retreated. And Hezekiah's kingdom continued. So here's a text that mentions, again, Jerusalem as the capital of this kingdom of Judah, and Hezekiah is the king. Hezekiah, again, is a very important figure. The Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin says that Hezekiah could have been Mashiach. He was supposed to be Mashiach, and then it didn't work out. So he was a really great figure who had a lot of potential, but unfortunately didn't work out to be the Messiah. Very important figure. And even more amazingly is that we have his seal. So recently, a seal in Jerusalem was found that actually says, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, the king of Yehuda. That's what's left of it. That's the seal. Yeah. So we have one of his seals. Like, again, Hezekiah, this important figure in the Tanakh, was a real person. We have evidence from the Assyrians that he was a real person. We have his seal, right, that he probably would have held, or one of his court officials. It's an amazing thing. And if you're wondering about the font or the script here, it's an ancient Hebrew script, right? So here's the ancient Hebrew alphabet. If you want to see how to write your name in ancient Hebrew, a little bit different than today. So this is ancient Israelite script. And if you were wondering, I hope you were wondering, because it's an important question, was the Torah written in ancient Israelite script? Right? Because we say our Torah is written in, of course, these letters, right? The royal, it's called like Royal Aramaic letters or Royal Assyrian script. That's what historians might call it. So what was the Torah written in? Because we say our Torah is the same. It's been copied, with high, what's the word, accuracy for 3,000 years, from Moshe, and for over 3,000 years. So did Moshe write the Torah in ancient Hebrew or in this kind of script, in more classical Hebrew? And the Gemara actually discusses this, and there's two opinions. So some people say that the Torah was given in ancient Hebrew, the original Torah, and in the time of Ezra, after the Babylonian exile, Ezra transcribed the Torah into these letters because those are the letters that the people were familiar with, having lived in Assyria and in Babylon. They were familiar with the Aramaic script. It's the same alphabet, just different font. So Ezra Sofer, Ezra the scribe, according to one opinion, he is the one that changed the font of the Torah. But according to another opinion, the Torah was always given in this font. And the ancient Israelites didn't want to use the holy font, this font, which is holy, so they created a cursive, like day-to-day font, so that they wouldn't have to use holy Torah font for mundane daily activities, right? Which is kind of like partially why, let's say today in the more Haredi world, generally like modern Hebrew is not a thing. Like they'll still speak Yiddish most of the time, because the idea is that like Hebrew is Lashon HaKodesh, right? We shouldn't be talking about our taxes and buying paper towels at Costco in holy Hebrew script, So we should use Hebrew only for holy matters. And so for other language, like for other day-to-day stuff, we'd speak Yiddish or whatever. So it's kind of like that. So in ancient times, according to one opinion in the Gemara, that it was the same. Is there a question? So in ancient times, it was the same, that they didn't want to use the holy original script. And so they devised a cursive, like more for mundane purposes. I think I go with that opinion. That makes more sense. More from a Kabbalistic perspective also, that makes more sense. And it's a topic for another time to actually trace it. Maybe we'll do that. But from a more mystical perspective, that is the case. The Torah was always given in this script. And this was the just day-to-day secular script. Also, we have the prophet Ishayahu, Isaiah's seal. That's important because Hezekiah's court prophet was Isaiah. Okay, Isaiah and Hezekiah, they go together. And Ishayahu and Navi, we have a seal that has Ishayahu and Navi written on it. So it's amazing. We have the prophet of Isaiah, the seal of the prophet Isaiah. Again, very important prophet in the Tanakh. One of the longest books of prophecy is the book of Isaiah. And we have his seal. So this is a real person. It actually says Ishayahu Navi on it. Amazing. And Ishayahu, in one of his prophecies, actually says that Israel will be saved by the king of Persia, Koresh, Cyrus, and he will free the Jews from the Babylonian captivity and allow them to go back to Israel and rebuild their temple. And Isaiah actually calls Koresh Mashiach, like God's Mashiach, God's anointed one, that God chose this Persian, not Jewish, right? God chose this Persian guy, Cyrus, to free the Jews, right? So he was anointed by God. That was one of Isaiah's prophecies. And this happens, as we know, the Persian Empire kind of takes over the Babylonian Empire. King Cyrus is the main figure in that transition. And we have one of his cylinders, the Cyrus Cylinder, which actually shows that he really did do what the Tanakh says he did, that he allowed all the people in his new empire to go back to their ancestral lands, to rebuild their temples. He was a very tolerant ruler. He didn't force his religion upon others. He said, let everybody practice whatever religion they want. So it says in his cylinder, I returned the images of the gods who resided there to their places and let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned them to their dwellings. Okay, so we have, again, something inscribed by a person named in the Tanakh, a king, Cyrus, Koresh, and he's writing from in his own words, what the Tanakh says he did and would do. Okay? Pretty amazing. So this is when the Israelites or the Jews came back to Israel and rebuilt the temple, second temple. And just a couple more. The Persepolis Tablet looks like this, mentions a person, an official in the court of King Xerxes, famous King Xerxes, named Mardukah. So if you didn't connect it yet, Mardukah is Mordechai. Xerxes is just the Greek version of Ahasuerus. Okay, we say Xerxes, but in the ancient Persian language, he was called Hashayarsha, which is Ahasuerus. Okay, so we have a tablet. I mean, that Xerxes was a king was no doubt, for sure. Very famous king. So Xerxes and Mordechai. Okay, we have a tablet that mentions both of these names. Incredible. And Natan Melech, okay, is mentioned in the Tanakh as one of the officials in the court of King Yoshiyahu, Josiah, and we have his seal as well. The seal that says the name Natan Melech on it. Really amazing. So, and there's, again, this is just a small sample of the evidence. There's much, much more. The last one before we get to the Exodus, one of the big events in the Torah is the destruction of Sodom. That happens with Abraham, right? Abraham sees it happening. He has a discussion with God beforehand. He actually questions God. God, are you sure you want to destroy this place? Maybe there's some, 50 righteous people there. Like, are you really going to flatten it? Like, he's trying to be really an amazing, it just shows his level of, I don't even know how to say it, just being so ahead of his time that he's arguing with God, trying to get God not to destroy an entire city and spare the innocents. And archaeologists have always known that there appears to be in this area, in the Dead Sea area, that civilization there was a very big and flourishing civilization there, and that it was wiped out around 3,700 years ago, roughly when Abraham would have lived. And now what they found is that there's a huge, basically, meteorite crater there, and it would have destroyed, at that time period, a meteorite would have crashed, destroyed an area of 500 square kilometers. And based on their own words, they found that the houses at that time period would have vanished and only the stone foundations were left behind. The fertile land was just destroyed, parched. And they even found that clay potsherds were heated to such a high level that they turned into glass from the impact of this meteorite. So this region was totally destroyed by what the Torah says, fire and brimstone, right? At the right time, in the right place, right? So even for that. So archaeologists see a meteorite, and the Torah tells us the same, that God sent fireballs from the sky and destroyed this entire place, right? Destroyed the land. It's really amazing. So we have like, not just historical, scientific evidence, for this. All right, so let's get to the Exodus. We have not that much time left. The biggest question of all. Where is the evidence for the Exodus? This is important because this is like the foundation of the Jewish people, right? It's like our Independence Day This is when we became a nation, when God took us out of Egypt and formed us into an actual people. So do we have evidence that a Semitic tribe of some sort took control of Egypt first? Because first Yosef became like the president of Egypt, right? He brought in his family. They lived very well at first. They took on really high positions, and then the Egyptians became jealous of them. And as Israel prospered, the Egyptians were more envious and eventually enslaved them. So do we have evidence of that, of foreign Semitic people taking over Egypt, but then maybe being expelled, maybe enslaved? Do we have evidence of plagues? How about the splitting of the sea? Let's see. So every historian and Egyptologist will agree and admit that yes, Egypt was ruled by a Semitic people for a time. It's called the intermediate period. Here's a little bit of a timeline: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and then you have this period that's called the Hyksos period, the intermediate period, a foreign rule. Okay, they're called the Hyksos. Hyksos, that's what we call them. Okay, so the Hyksos means, actually, according to one translation, foreign kings or shepherd kings. Okay? So everybody knows that, no doubt, that there was a time in Egypt's history where a Semitic tribe, Canaanite tribe, took over and ruled. And they're known as the Hyksos. The timing is precisely when we would expect, based on our Torah chronology. It's right at the right time. And when we say the Israelites were in Egypt. And the Hyksos period, right after it ended, who were the pharaohs that followed? Ramses I and II. Doesn't really get better than that, does it? Right? So they would have been in power, and then the Hyksos were defeated. The Egyptians took over control back of their own kingdom, and the first dynasty after this is that of Ramses I and II and Seti and those guys. And like we said before, the Torah tells us that the Israelite slaves built the city of Ramses. So the chronology here, at least the sequence of events, is perfect. Yeah. Hyksos means, like I said, foreign kings or shepherd kings. And that's perfect because if you remember in the Torah, when Yosef comes and Yosef's family comes and Pharaoh asks them, what do you guys do? And they say, we are shepherds. Right? So they want to live in Goshen in the northeast, right here in the northeastern side of the Nile, and where there's place to lots of pastures and stuff for their flocks. So they say, we're shepherds. We want to live here where there's space to shepherd our flocks, and that's where they go. And here's the Avaris, the city that we saw in the previous video, right, where they dug up the seals with Yaakov's name on it. So Avaris is right in the center of Goshen. So the geographic location is perfect. The chronology works. So it all comes together. So I want to show you another excerpt.
Well, look at the evidence that you've got here. Right at the beginning, at the heart of this community, at the end of the 12th dynasty, we see a Syrian house appear. The Austrians call them Mittelsaal houses. This type of house is found in North Syria, the area where Abraham came from. It's exactly the same style of house you'd expect Jacob to build for himself in Egypt.
So again, he's talking about this area of ours, and they're finding not an Egyptian style house, but a Syrian construction for some reason in Egypt.
And we know that the Israelites sought their brides from Haran in that region. They all went back to get their brides from there. So the culture that turns up in Egypt at the end of the 12th dynasty seems to have come from North Syria originally.
So what is the connection with Joseph out of Avaris?
Well, after this house of Jacob, if we can call it that, is built, eventually it's flattened, and on top of it, an Egyptian palace is constructed, Egyptian architecture this time. However, the occupant was not Egyptian. The palace had courtyards, colonnades, audience chambers. There was even a robing room. It obviously belonged to some high official of state who was very, very important to that state. Because when somebody gets a palace like this given to them, it means they're being honored for what they've done for the state. Now, in the garden behind the palace, the archaeologists found 12 main graves with memorial chapels on top of them.
You have 12 graves?
We have 12 graves.
And why would that be significant?
Well, think about it. How many sons did Jacob have?
How
many tribes were there?
12 tribes.
Exactly. And what's also amazing is the palace had a facade, a portico with 12 pillars. So you've got 12 sons, 12 tribes, 12 pillars, and 12 tombs.
Interesting.
Yeah, is that all coincidence? Now, one of these 12 graves was very special because it was a pyramid tomb. This in itself is extraordinary because only pharaohs and queens had pyramid tombs at this time. Yet the person buried in this tomb was not a king. Even so, he was honored with a king's burial. And inside the chapel of the tomb was a statue. What we know from the statue is that this man had red hair. He had pale yellow skin, which is how Egyptians depict northerners. He had a throw stick across his shoulder, a unique symbol of office made for this Asiatic official living in the land of Goshen. And on the back of his shoulder, we see the faintest remains of paint, colored stripes from a multicolored coat. And that matches exactly with the story of Joseph in the Bible. The multicolored coat is a gift which shows that he was the favorite of the father. And it almost becomes his insignia, this coat. It's the thing we remember about him most of all.
Do you know of any other statues of a Semite of this kind in Egypt?
There is nothing else like this in the whole of Egyptian history.
Really?
Nothing at all.
David Roll is not the only one to see a connection with Joseph at Avaris. Mahoney went to see Professor Charles Ayling, an Egyptologist who has also investigated the events of the Exodus and its connection to Egypt.
Would it be unusual for a tomb to have a statue?
No, it's unusual to have one this large. This would be probably twice the size of a normal human being.
What does that tell you when the statue's larger?
That it's a very important person. Now, of course, this is not a pharaoh's tomb or palace, but the man who lived there, you can identify his nationality by looking at the fragments of the statue. Three things: the hairstyle he has, which we often call the mushroom hairstyle, and then secondly, the weapon he carries over his shoulder called a throw stick, which we would associate with like an Australian boomerang, and then the coloration of the skin. The skin is yellow. All those things indicate that this would have been a Syro-Palestinian.
Dr. Ayling, do you think this is Joseph?
Either it is Joseph or it's somebody that has a career remarkably the same as Joseph did. It's just an incredible thing to find this at this time period.
So hope that was convincing enough, right? So you have something that's really amazing, possibly the tomb of Yosef and maybe even the rest of the brothers. And maybe this is where he was buried originally. But of course, we know the Torah says that his bones were exhumed when the Israelites left, because Yosef made his children promise him that when the Israelites would leave, they would take his remains with him. So, I mean, there's no mummy there now, but he might have been buried there originally and then taken out when the Israelites left. So really an amazing finding. And that was David Roll, very famous Egyptologist, by the way.
Well, look at the evidence.
Okay. Now, what about the 10 plagues? So we have something called the Ipuwer Papyrus, okay, also known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer. It's written in hieratic script, which is what the Egyptian court officials would write in. They didn't use hieroglyphics for their actual records because that would be really inconvenient, right, to keep having to draw all these pictures. So the hieroglyphics were meant for the general public that was illiterate. Everybody can understand pictures, but the actual people in the palaces and the courts would write in proper script that you could, write long, detailed records in. And it dates to the 19th dynasty, again, to this period following the Hyksos era. And they think that the actual text goes back to the 12th dynasty, way before this whole thing, before the Hyksos era. And it's written in the style of prophecy, okay, by an Egyptian person called Ipuwer, all right? Ipuwer is a prophet, and he's writing what appears to be a prophecy or a warning, okay? And what does it say? So he's saying that these Asiatics are taking over, Canaanites, foreigners are taking over. The tribes of the desert have become Egyptians everywhere. The chiefs of the land flee. He says that slaves are leaving their posts. The washerman refuses to carry his load. The servant takes what he finds. More significantly, the river is blood, yet men drink of it. Men shrink from human beings and thirst after water. Behold, things have been done which have not happened for a long time past. The king has been deposed by the rabble. How comes it that every man kills his brother? Think about all these things, what he's saying. River turns to blood. There's a civil war, people killing each other. If you remember, one of the reasons that we commemorate Shabbat HaGadol before Pesach is because Egypt went into civil war. When Moshe warned that all the firstborn would die, it caused a civil war in Egypt because all the firstborn were saying, hey, we're going to die. You know, they went to the Pharaoh and said, let him go. And they actually started fighting amongst themselves. So Ipuwer is saying there was a civil war. Every man killed his brother. Talks about Hanun groans because of his wariness. Behold, men have fallen into rebellion against the Uraeus of Ra. So they're gods. He's describing the gods of Egypt as being defeated. Right? So again, think of what happens in the Torah. How does the Torah describe this? The 10 plagues were meant to be to show the Egyptians that their gods are foolish and idols, meaningless, right? Have no power. God made the sky dark. Why did he make the sky dark? Because made the sun disappear. Because one of the main gods in Egypt was Ra, the god of the sun. So God wanted to show, there are no idols. The sun is just the sun, right? It's just a ball of hydrogen gas. It's not a god. And I can turn it off if I want to, right? So God was trying to prove with the 10 plagues, show everybody that idolatry is nonsensical and meaningless. And he defeated the gods of Egypt, right? So that the Egyptians themselves said, Etzba Elokimhi, that it's the finger of God. And Ipuwer himself actually says that because he addresses his thing at the end. He actually prays to who he calls the Lord of all. That's what he says. It's like the Egyptian gods have been defeated, and he prays to he calls the Lord of all. Just like what we see in the Torah when the Egyptian magician admitted that Etzba Elokimhi, yes, your God is the God, the one God. And Ipuwer concludes in the same way and says that there's the one Lord of all. Amazing. He says how towns in Upper Egypt, towns are destroyed and Upper Egypt has become an empty waste. Pestilences throughout the land, blood is everywhere. Fire has gone up on high. You see, it's like most of the plagues are being described here. Of course, again, there are always skeptics that are going to say, no, the Ipuwer Papyrus has nothing to do with the Exodus, just a coincidence or whatever. There's always going to be people who try to deny it. But there have been multiple Egyptologists who are trying to be unbiased and say, well, listen, can't really deny the connection. Like, this is really an incredible thing. It's from the right time period. It's discussing, there's just too many overlaps here for it to just be a coincidence or to be unrelated or whatever. It's an amazing thing. Okay, what about the splitting of the sea? So to understand this, we have to actually figure out, well, where did they cross, right? Like, where was the Red Sea crossing? Where is Mount Sinai? Generally, we are taught that this is Sinai, right? We call it Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, but if this is not actually biblical Sinai, right? So the general understanding is like the Israelites maybe crossed somewhere here, and then they were like wandering over here. But really, what happened was, if you read what the Torah says they were walking this way for a while, and then God told them, hey, turn around and go this way. And Pharaoh said, wait, what are they doing? Why are they going this way? Why not just go directly to Israel like that? Like, the Torah specifically says that God led them away from the coast. He didn't take them derech Plishtim, through this way. This is the area of the Plishtim, right? Gaza. So he says he didn't take them along the coast. God specifically told them to turn and go away from the coast. Walk this way. Then they walked, reached the end. God said, okay, now turn around, go the other way. And Pharaoh said, what are they doing? They must be confused. Here's our chance to destroy them. And then the Egyptians pursue them and catch them over here. Okay? And when Israel crosses, they cross the Red Sea here at the Gulf of Aqaba into what is today roughly Saudi Arabia. Because the Torah tells us that Sinai is in the land of Midian, in the area of the Midianites. The Midianites were Bedouin Arabs. Midian is over here. Okay? And in Saudi Arabia today, by the way, this is called Midian. This is the land of, they call it that too. And there's no doubt about that. So Mount Sinai is here somewhere, not here. And Israel crossed the Red Sea at the Gulf of Aqaba here. What's amazing is that at the Gulf of Aqaba, there happens to be one place called Nuweiba today, which is just perfectly positioned for a large nation of people to gather on this beach. You have all this mountain area, If you can see closely here, it's hard to see, but there's a little pass through the mountains, very narrow pass. And then you have all these mountains here and a large beach area. So imagine the Israelites getting through these mountains, and now they're here at the beach, and then the Egyptians are following along here. There's nowhere to go, right? You got mountains here, mountains here. The Egyptians are blocking this route, coming towards them, and you're on the beach. Where do you go? So you've got to cross over here. Some people will claim that there is actually a land bridge here, that the water is really shallow. That's not true. The water is not shallow. The water is actually very deep there. It's about 700 meters. It's extremely deep. And it's supposed to be deep, okay? Because the people who argue that there's a land bridge here, they're ignoring the geological evidence, but they also think that they're doing the Bible, doing the Torah a service by making it more likely that they would have crossed where the water is shallow. But why do we need the water to be shallow, first of all? The shallowness of the water is irrelevant when you're dealing with a miracle. But more importantly, the Torah actually tells us that the water was deep. It's the opposite is true. The Torah actually tells us that where they crossed, it was a miracle because the waters were so deep where they crossed. And the Torah says, we sing this every Shabbat, in Shirat Hayam, when we sing, I mean, we can say it every day, but we sing it on Shabbat. What is the pasuk that we say in Shirat Hayam? We say, Kaf'u tehomot beleviam, right? Where the Israelites crossed, they sang that song after they crossed the Red Sea. And when they sang the song, they said what happened, and they said, Kaf'u tehomot beleviam, the depths of the sea. They crossed in a place that was extremely deep. And the depths of the sea froze for them. So God made a miracle. Kaf'u, God froze the depths of the sea so that they walked on smooth skating rink. That was a miracle. Maybe it wasn't slippery, but God made a miracle that he froze the bottom of the sea so they could walk on a smooth plain. So we don't need there to be a land bridge here at all, actually. And the miracle is all the more greater, like the Torah says, because the waters were extremely deep and the bottom layers were frozen so that they can cross on a nice flat surface. So do we find evidence of, drowned chariots here at the Red Sea crossing? Let's see.
In the spring of 2000, a robotic camera was lowered into these waters for the first time.
This has never been done. No one have been in the area at all with a remote control camera.
The robotic camera's survey revealed many shapes and objects familiar to Muller, including coral formations with right angles, arches, discs, and straight shafts fused into larger masses that had the appearance of twisted wreckage.
Now, when we have been able to go back and forth with a remote control camera, we can repeatedly see that these strange structures we are looking for are there. Not at one place, but you see them again and again and again. There are situations where you see something that looks like an axle, a hub, something that looks like a wheel, and you say to yourself, this is not a coral reef, this is a coral growth on an artifact. And that is what's different to me when I compare corals at other locations around the world.
Since the earliest explorations at Nuweiba, one distinctive type of formation has often been identified on the sea floor. A slender, table-like structure, sometimes standing on end, with a coral-encrusted base, a straight shaft, and a circular top.
It's a 90-degree angle, a right angle, between something that looks like an axle and the wheel. And you can see this in different varieties, and it looks very different from normal coral growth. And it is like a man-made structure with a coral growth on it.
In the midst of them, Pan Chien photographed this circular object attached to what appears to have been a broken axle or hub. This discovery was significant for two reasons. Pontien had documented the coral-encrusted form of a wheel with dimensions similar to ancient Egyptian artifacts, directly across from the proposed Nuweiba crossing site. Her find also provided independent confirmation of earlier evidence establishing wheel-like formations on both coasts of the Red Sea, in accordance with descriptions in the biblical record.
As you see, I chose this video because it's shorter, but you can actually find a longer video that goes into more depth, that shows you more specifically all the different actual wheels that they found and how they match the Egyptian chariot wheels of that time period, which would have had 6 spokes on them. And this one didn't go in much depth, but there is, if you poke around on YouTube a little bit, you'll find like longer, more in-depth videos that actually show the wheels, and it's all like corals growing on it, as you would expect, because this happened obviously over 3,000 years ago. So you're not going to find much, but it's amazing that we do still find ancient Egyptian chariots following ancient Egyptian construction, as we know, with the right number of spokes and the right size and so on, at this place. And of course, it's encrusted now with all kinds of corals and algae and things like that. But we do have it. It's an amazing find nonetheless, right? Right where the best candidate for where the crossing would have been, where the geography fits, it's the right place. Everything just works out very neatly. And if you go diving over there, you find ancient Egyptian chariots, or at least the remains of some of these ancient Egyptian chariots. It's really an amazing thing. Okay, so, and the last one, I know we're a bit over time, but the last one is Mount Sinai. Okay, so of course, after the crossing, we're heading to Mount Sinai. So where is Mount Sinai? If it's not in the Sinai Peninsula, where is that? Over here, right across, so there's Nuweiba, right? There's Nuweiba where they would have crossed. Over here, you have the Midian mountain range, Madian Mountains, it's called today in Saudi Arabia. And over here, you have a mountain called Jebel Maqla. It's the burnt mountain, and it's also known as Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses. And the top of this mountain, as I'll show you in a second in this video, is actually burned. It's very strange. The mountain itself looks like it's been burned by something. And if you remember what the Torah says about Mount Sinai, when God descended on Sinai, right, there was all this fire and smoke and flames, torches. So we'd expect to see the cap of the mountain burned, charred, blackened. And there's all kinds of other really cool things that they found there. So I want to show you in this video.
Debris. New research shows that Christian, Jewish, and Islamic sources for a long time have identified the real Mount Sinai as being the highest mountain near an area of Saudi Arabia called Al-Bad today. And if you go to Al-Bad today, the highest mountain is the Jebel al-Lawz mountain range, and specifically a peak named Jebel Maqla, which means burned mountain. The reason it's called burned mountain is because it has a blackened top that makes it very distinct, and you can see it from far away. And so that leads people to see it and question, is this evidence of God descending upon the mountain in the form of a fire like the Bible says? The locals refer to this mountain as the Mountain of Moses. And they will tell you how generations after generations have known that this was the real Mount Sinai. In front of this mountain, just like the Bible says, you can see a collection of rocks that have inscriptions of people worshiping bulls. And the local tradition is that this is the golden calf worship site, to the point where locals will even suspect you of searching for gold if you go there. So we know from the book of Exodus that God tells Moses to set up an altar of uncut stone without steps at the foot of the mountain, and next to that altar to set up 12 pillars to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. When you go to the foot of this candidate for Mount Sinai, known as the Mountain of Moses, you come across an ancient altar where you could see where the animals would have been lined up for sacrifice. It is made of uncut stone and it has no steps. And next to it are the remains of about 12 marble pillars. One of the biggest miracles of the Exodus story that many people would find hard to believe is the story that God told Moses to go up to a rock and strike it with his rod so that water could pour forth and his people could have water to drink from who were dying of thirst. Amazingly, along this route to the possible Mount Sinai, you come across a gigantic split rock on top of a 100-foot hill, and the rock itself is between 40 and 60 feet high. When you climb it, you look like an ant next to it, and down the split in the middle and the rock below, it's smooth. The adjacent areas are all rough with different types of rocks. It's very bumpy. But then in this area, it looks like water poured forth from that rock, from the split, coming down the hill onto the ground below. And the local Bedouins, who have been told to keep people out and will actually confront you if you go there, will say that this is referred to by them as the split rock of Moses. At one point in my life, I thought that as human knowledge developed and as science developed, we would move further from the biblical account, that those would look more and more like myth. Now I see that it's looking more and more like an accurate historical account.
So how amazing is that? So you have all these pieces of evidence, right, to suggest. And again, note how he says how the Bedouins are being told, don't let anybody in here, keep people out. Again, trying to suppress that evidence, keep it hidden.
Debris.
So in sum, we went through a lot today. Just to summarize quickly, we saw tablets that have Abraham's name on it, seals that have Jacob's name on it, Yaakov's name, in the right place, in the right time. We know for sure that a Semitic tribe definitely ruled Egypt for a long period of time, and then they were slaves, and then there was some exodus. We see evidence for splitting of the sea. We see Mount Sinai. We even see evidence for the 10 plagues. We see God's name mentioned in extra biblical tablets from 3,000 years ago. We see the name Israel. We see the name Yehuda. We see the names of all these people, all these key characters in the Tanakh. From Ahav and Omri and David and all these people, and Hezekiah and Yoshiao and all these people, mentioning Jerusalem and cities, Yehuda, incredible. So this is just, of course, the tip of the iceberg, just a small sampling of the evidence, but I hope it's enough to show you that what the Tanakh is describing is not just stories, right? This is real. These are real people. These were real events. Okay, we have confirmation of these events from historical, archaeological, scientific sources, evidence. So it's amazing that we have all this. And I think we just need to get that information out there because it's been suppressed for too long. And we need to show people, show the world that these are not just stories. This is real. This is real stuff. It's amazing that we have this. So I hope you enjoyed this. And if there are any questions or comments, we can talk about that now. So thank you.